Okay, today we're talking about special education. This is really kind of an interesting chapter for me because I was born in 1949 and I started school in 1955. I graduated from high school in 1967. The special education laws weren't written until 1974. By that time, I was already in the military and moving down the line. The special education rules and classes that you guys are very much aware of didn't come to pass until after I received my teaching license. Eventually, of course, I had to take classes in special education. They called it classes for exceptional children at that time. That was when I was in Oklahoma. This is really different as far as I can see, because most of the individuals that they're talking about were educated in our classrooms. Um, so we didn't have anybody with any profound problems. We had people that suffered from diabetes, individuals that suffered from asthma. We had individuals that had orthopedic problems. We didn't have anybody in a wheelchair that I can remember. But anyway, there were individuals that were slow academically and that were educated with everybody else. So this is uh, new, and there's a reason why they needed to pass the law in 1974. It's because not all states were doing what Indiana was doing. A lot of states were housing these select individuals and not allowing them to go to school. But that wasn't the case in Indiana when I was there. So let's go ahead and get into the chapter. Let's see what we've got. Today, education has moved away from language that defines a person by a single characteristic. Using the term mentally retarded child places a characteristic of intellectual disability before the child. Linguistically, this makes intellectual disability a powerful descriptor of the person. Using language that makes the person primary and any characteristic secondary has the advantage of maintaining the importance of the whole person. Many organizations have adopted this person first approach, including the American Psychological Association and the Federal Office of Civil Rights. And if we look at that lady speaking, she's saying words matter, but she's English. You could tell from the way that she mata instead of matter. Yeah, there you go. She's English. She's a Brit. Advocates for person first language remind us that the individuals with exceptionalities are people first. They are not defined by a disability. They are complicated individuals with many strengths and weaknesses. Their strengths are just as important to recognize as their weaknesses. Failure to use person first language focuses more on a single difference rather than individual strengths. We need to be able to discuss learning differences, but we can use language in ways that preserve a focus on the whole person. Being different is an interesting phenomenon. Different is really a perception or a judgment. It is not an absolute condition. We are all different or special. If we conceptualize differences as positive, differences become an asset or something desirable. All too often, being different is not viewed positively. This is particularly noticeable in our schools. Some differences are social, others are academic or behavioral. Our society values some characteristics and devalues others. This influences our thinking and focuses our perceptions in one direction or another. Academic performance is different. In schools, we document student progress through assessments. This results in our positive and negative perceptions, building on a specific assessment scale. Teachers label certain scores as passing and others as failing. Naturally, students value passing grades and hope to avoid failing grades. Standardized test scores have acceptable scores and scores as atypical. Nonspecific labels, such as "she is acting weird," are not likely to generate consistent perceptions or judgment. For students, weird may mean one thing today and something entirely different another day. It is also a student assigned label rather than a label from an authority figure. This produces fewer rigid perceptions. Labels perceived to be medical, psychological, or educational from an authority figure are different. Students often perceive these labels as permanent and negative. Disability usually refers to a reduced capacity to perform in some domain. Using this definition, a student has a disability if they experience diminished capacity leading to a limitation. Perhaps the student has a diminished ability to use his or her legs, leading to a limitation in mobility. Disability is often confused with handicap. This term is quite different. Handicap refers to a situational disadvantage. This means that the person has a disability affecting their performance in that particular situation. Labeling students provides several benefits. Labeling enables students to qualify for needed special education services. Participation in special education requires a student to meet certain eligibility criteria. These criteria are grouped around 13 diagnostic labels. Without qualifying for one of these labels, students are ineligible for services. Labels also help professionals communicate more effectively when programming for students with special needs. Labels help parents and professionals access information on students with similar differences because research, treatment, and educational information are often cataloged using diagnostic labels. A parent may have a sense that their child's behavior is unusual. If testing reveals mild autistic symptoms, then the parent has a very specific label from which to gather information and support. Not all of the information on autism will be applicable to their child, but the label helps narrow what can seem like an overwhelming amount of information on development. Overall, many believe that the benefits of the labeling outweigh the limitations. Labeling has some unwanted effects. We hope that peers will handle the knowledge that a student has a particular diagnostic label with respect. However, it is often used as a source of ridicule. Labeling can also inappropriately focus a teacher's attention on a student's difficulty rather than strengths. Research with learning disabilities has shown that it can lead to problems with self concept and self esteem, negative perceptions by teachers and peers, and difficulties with social interactions. It should be noted that not all research on labeling indicates negative outcomes. Some research has actually found an increase in self esteem of students with learning disabilities following diagnosis. The label helps a teacher get a general picture of the student's difficulties. Labels may convey a sense of permanence. Special education is a system of support, and this support is provided as long as it is needed. The hope is that extra support is temporary and will help students transition back into the regular education curriculum. Although many share this hope, the reality is often different. In 2002, the Department of Education looked at special education students 14 years of age and older to determine whether they continued with services. They found that only 3.5% returned to the regular education classroom. So that means that 96.5% stayed in the special ed classroom. Once you get in, you don't move out. To ensure the adequate services reach every student in need, a critical piece of legislation was passed in 1975. I'm sorry, I said it was 1974. It was 1975. Education for All Handicapped Children Act, Public Law 94-142, provided for free and appropriate educational services for all children with handicaps. This law formally established special education in a new era in how schools addressed unique educational needs. The law provided students with special needs specific educational rights. Public Law 94-142 provided needed funding for schools providing services to students with disabilities. Special education service delivery is costly, and a national funding source was needed to support local school efforts. This is a point of fact. There were a lot of states in the country that didn't want to have to put the money out for this. They didn't want to pay for any of this stuff. So they passed 94 Public Law 94-142, and after that the federal government was matching funds with different states. Now the problem was before that you had select states that were dealing with special education, like Indiana. It wasn't the only one. There were other states that were helping children that had problems. But there were states that reneged. There were states that didn't do anything for a student with special needs. And if they had a student with special needs, they either moved to a state that had special education or they didn't educate them. They didn't do anything to help. Public Law 94-142 specified that each specific needs student must have an individualized education program or an IEP. This is a formal document detailing the nature of the special education services for each child. Special education services must be provided in the least restrictive environment. This means students need to receive appropriate services, but these services need to interfere as little as possible with the typical educational experience of the child. Public Law 94-142 provided specific rights to parents of students with disabilities. The process for determining need for services and basic procedures for service delivery are clearly specified in the law. In addition, the law necessitates that parents participate in a meaningful way in the educational process. Education for All Handicapped Children Act provided a foundation for special education services. This has also undergone several revisions as the law adapts to changing societal needs and is now referred to as the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or the IDEA. In 2004, change modified the name slightly, renaming the law the Individual with Disabilities Education Improvement Act, IDEIA. Although the acronym IDEIA is technically the most accurate and current, most articles and researchers still use the term IDEA. Inclusion is the practice of grouping children for education based on traditional factors like age and location of the student's home. According to inclusion practices, students are not excluded from their typical classroom placement for reasons like disability status, learning ability, behavior, health, or social ability. And before they could exclude you from a class for any reason that they selected, you could have asthma, they didn't want to educate you. You could be diabetic, they didn't want to educate you. You could have epilepsy, they didn't want to educate you. You have autism, they didn't want to have anything to do with you. They wanted you to go to a special school, if at all. They wanted to institutionalize you. When I first started in psychology in the 1970s, my abnormal psychology text said that 70% of all autistic children are mute, couldn't speak at all. So what was coming out in the 1970s was the fact that they were not doing anything with these children. They weren't using any behavior modification. They weren't doing anything with them. They were institutionalizing them. They were housing them, and that was it. They didn't educate them at all. They didn't even try to teach them to speak. They just shut them away. And that's what was going on in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s until this law was passed. You may be having difficulty writing down a definition for inclusion or finding this confusing. You're not alone. Inclusion has emerged as one of the most debated educational issues of the 21st century, and usually it has to do with money. And when I say it has to do with money, what I mean is people don't want to spend it. They don't want to be taxed more for somebody else's kid. This is especially true of older individuals because, like me, they weren't educated with inclusion. So, because of that, they don't think that they should have to pay for it as elderly individuals, as strange and confusing as that is. Full inclusion is when all students are maintained in their homeschool classroom setting all the time. Sometimes, however, students with special needs receive services using other approaches. Pull-out services provide educational services outside the regular classroom. A special trained teacher, often in another specially dedicated classroom, provides services. The number of hours a day a student is pulled out of the regular classroom will vary. This means the degree to which the student is included will also vary. That should be V-E-R-Y, not V-A-R-Y. No, that's right. That's the right spelling. It is important to realize that not all students receiving special education services are included in the regular classroom. Some students receive all their education services in specialized classrooms within the regular school. Others receive all their services in separate specialized educational schools. These varying approaches to providing special education services represent a continuum of care. And before 1975, when the Public Law 94-142 was written, every state in the Union had their own school for the deaf and school for the blind. Some of them had these schools back in the 19th century. Others didn't get these schools until 1975. And it's a little surprising as to which states we're talking about. Most of the new states, most of the western states, west of the Mississippi River, as soon as they became states, or even before they became states, they opened up schools for the deaf and blind. Um, Most states in the Midwest opened up their schools in the 19th century. Most schools in the South opened up their schools for the deaf and blind in the 19th century. It's mostly schools in the Northeast. Maryland was one of the last states to include a Maryland school for the deaf and blind. And another one is Connecticut, strangely enough. So, this is it. All that had to do with state. It had to, the state. It had to do with funding. It had to do with how they wanted to educate their children. Qualifying a student for special education services is a comprehensive process. Before assessment even begins, students go through a variety of less formal interventions to determine if a referral for special education services is warranted. This process is called pre-referral. Pre-referral interventions are efforts to address specialized student needs without formal participation in special education. A student may receive classroom accommodations without further pull-out needs. Making such accommodations maximizes existing classroom supports and minimizes unwarranted referrals for special education evaluation. In other words, what is happening, or what happens every time an individual is identified as a potentially special education student is that they will try to find ways around this so that they don't have to pull them out of the classroom and put them in a special classroom. They try to accommodate the students' needs in the regular classroom. There are several steps students go through when referred to for possible inclusion in the special education program. The nature of these steps depends on the age of the child, the nature of the disability, and the state in which they live. There are steps that are common in most referrals. The IDEA 2004 legislation specifically mandates a maximum of 60 days from the time parents sign the informed consent form into the completion of the evaluation. Two critical elements in this evaluation process are the formation of the evaluation team and the generation of individualized education programs. The evaluation team is charged with the development of the IEP, so its composition and collaborative effectiveness are important. The special education team builds on the strengths of the interdisciplinary model. According to this model, team members work in highly collaborative ways to achieve a desired outcome. When meeting special educational needs, the team consists of professionals and family as dictated by the learning needs of the student. The idea is to build an expertise of each team member to create a uniquely tailored educational experience. Interdisciplinary teams have several advantages. They are often an efficient use of resources and individual training strengths and help professionals feel connected and engaged in their professional duties. They create an environment where team members can learn from other professionals. Each team member brings a unique perception of the student's needs given their background and experience. This is particularly true for the student's parent or guardian, who plays a significant and meaningful role on the team. Parents are able to help the team understand evaluation results in terms of the student's day-to-day functioning. This is also true of the students themselves when their age and level of maturity allows them to fully participate in the team evaluation process. Probably one of the most important points to remember about the evaluation process is that the group shares decisions. It is a collaborative decision process. The effectiveness and accuracy of the outcome depends on the level of participation of the team members. The Special Education Evaluation Team is responsible for determining eligibility for services. It is charged with developing an intervention plan if services are needed. The plan for implementing services is detailed in a document called the Individualized Education Program. The IEP is a legal document specifying how the school is going to meet its obligations to provide free and appropriate public education to a student with special needs. The specific format of the document depends on individual state regulations and even particular school preferences. Some are generated with the help of specialized computer software. Others are written by hand on state forms. Regardless of the specific format used, federal law specifies certain components that must be present in the IEP. The IEP is a complex document. The depth of information is designed to address three primary objectives. The information documents the student's current level of functioning, establishing goals and objectives to guide the student toward a successful educational experience. The team is responsible for determining what services and support will help the child reach the documented educational goals. The team is responsible for determining appropriate and reasonable goals sensitive to the student's unique circumstances. The unique the uniqueness of each student's needs necessitates creative solutions. Every student presents an individual profile of strengths and weaknesses and will need an individualized combination of support to achieve educational and personal success. The issue of disproportionate representation of minority students in special education services is a continuous subject in the field of educational psychology. It has been traditionally argued that minority students, especially those of Black and Hispanic origin, are excessively represented in the special education program in comparison to their white counterparts. Current data shows a somewhat different picture, with Black students and American Indian Alaska Native students having the highest representation as indicated by the number of students served under IDEA by their representation in the total school population. Developmental delay refers to children aged 3 through 9, or any subset of that age range, who are experiencing delays in their development. The delays could be in one or more areas: physical, cognitive, communication, social, emotional, or adaptive development. If a child fits this description and needs special education and related services, they can receive the necessary support under IDEA. This approach is particularly useful when a child's development is delayed, but due to their young age may not align with specific disability qualifications. It should be noted that states have the option of using or modifying the definition for developmental delay and the ages to which it applies. It may also be helpful to know that under the IDEA, your state may not require that your local school district also adopt and use the term developmental delay in working with children. If your local school district decides to use the term, it must use the same definition and age range as the state does. Your local school district may not use the term at all if your state has chosen not to use the term. Since the late 1970s, the number of students identified as having a learning disability has risen. Some attitudes, this increases to a continued vagueness in the diagnostic criteria for the disability. Others assert that the increase is due to better diagnostic tools, greater public awareness of these disabilities, and greater acceptance. The federal definition of learning disability indicates it can affect multiple domain areas, including traditional academic areas such as reading, writing, and mathematics. It can also affect other areas such as listening, thinking, speaking, or spelling. The definition is quite broad, covering many different academic skills. The process of determining eligibility for special education services begins with a thorough evaluation. Documenting learning potential and learning achievement are common components of an assessment for learning disabilities. Learning potential is intended to be a measure of the student's general ability to learn. Learning achievement is a measure of what a student has achieved in academic work. The idea is that if a student has an adequate level of learning potential but is not achieving academically, then the student has a specific learning issue in their areas. Learning potential is typically assessed using an individualized intelligence test, and learning achievement is measured using a standardized achievement test. The student only needs to be assessed an academic area under consideration. The entire test battery is typically administered. This helps strengthen the evidence that the learning problem is indeed specific. Although standardized intellectual and achievement tests are commonly used in the assessment of learning disabilities, they're not without critics. An alternative approach to standardized testing is to use authentic assessments, which use assessment procedures resembling the actual work the student completes at school, home, or in daily life work. An example of an authentic test gaining attention is the portfolio. A portfolio is a collection of work samples and products used to determine student progress. Portfolios provide a real-life approach to assessment, meaningfully derived from the student's actual work. The problem leveled against using portfolios for assessment purposes is that they are often difficult to objectively grade and interpret. Some assessment approaches attempt to combine the qualities of the standardized test and the authentic testing process. Curriculum-based assessment assesses student progress using a standard assessment tool, but the test is derived from actual schoolwork detailed in the school's curriculum. This helps ensure the test is directly related to what the students are doing in the classroom. It is standardized in the sense that it is an actual test that the students take in a systematic fashion. Unlike traditional standardized tests, the focus is on comparing the student's own performance over time, not to the performance of other students. This enables the teachers to chart progress and devise appropriate interventions. A new identification approach for learning disability is response to intervention. RTI is a multi-step process to provide quality instruction to students with learning difficulties and to determine the need for special education services. RTI is a process for adapting instruction based on the unique needs of the child. The process typically begins with some form of formal or informal assessment that reveals a student is at risk for taking a learning issue. The teacher then designs an intervention appropriate for the student's struggles. Depending on the student's response to the intervention, the teacher may need to adapt instruction, providing an intensive intervention. If the difficulty persists, then educators from different disciplines typically convene in an intervention team to determine the degree of support necessary for successful and whether the student would benefit from inclusion in the special education program. This approach maintains a positive focus and concentrates efforts on developing intervention strategies depending on how the student responds to increasingly intense intervention efforts. The majority of students with learning disabilities, 75.1%, spend 80% or more of their time in the regular education classroom. A smaller percentage, 19.2%, spend between 40% and 79% of their time in the classroom. Educating so many students with specific learning disabilities in the regular classroom is the culmination of years of inclusive practice. Due to the inclusion movement, more students with exceptional learning needs are receiving instruction in the regular classroom. The type of instruction these students receive in the environment varies. The nature of the domain, reading, math, listening, of disability, combined with personal as well as institutional factors, will determine the type of educational program. And there's your pie. 75.1% are in regular classrooms. 19.2% are in between 40 and 70% of the time, and it goes downhill from there. Regardless of the type of learning disability, one general educational approach to learning issues is cognitive training. This is a term used to describe educational approaches focused on the modification of a student's thought processes. Instructional efforts concentrate on changing the student's thinking about the material to produce changes in academic performance. Teachers use this approach in a variety of formal and informal ways. If the teachers help a student reflect on thinking that resulted in an incorrect answer, they are encouraging the student to develop an awareness of their cognitions. This relates to the idea of metacognition, or thinking about our thought processes. Using this approach, the teacher can help the student recognize errors in thinking and develop effective solutions for modifying thoughts regarding the subject matter. Another approach frequently used when teaching students with learning disabilities is direct instruction. This is a systematic approach for teaching a defined academic skill. The philosophy is that students will learn more efficiently when instruction is clear and consistent. Under direct instruction, a learning task is divided into clearly defined steps. Each step is then taught until the student reaches mastery. Other steps would then build upon preceding steps. Learning is detailed and specific, and students are taught under the controlled and prescribed situation. During a direct instruction lesson, the teacher is not free to respond in spontaneous and creative ways, but instead has a set of script of responses to encourage a specific type of learning. Direct instruction models help students develop specific skills and a solid foundation. The rigid implementation procedures do not allow teachers to create novel responses to the unique ongoing needs of the students. There are three primary disorders of speech: phonological disorders, fluency disorders, and voicing problems. Phonological disorders are characterized by articulation errors during speech production. Perhaps a student omits certain consonant sounds, or substitutes one speech sound for another, or even distorts certain speech sounds. For example, a student who says, "I like ice cream," is substituting the W sound for the L sound. I like ice cream. Often this begins in the beginning period because the child has difficulty making certain speech sounds. And this would be, mispronouncing your R's or whatever. Fluency disorders are more commonly referred to as a stutter. The nature of a fluency problem often goes beyond popular perceptions of stuttering. Students may repeat initial consonant sounds like WH, but may repeat sounds in the middle of the word or even whole words. Fluency disorders also cover problems with the student's pace of speech. Some students speak in a rapid-fire way that makes their speech unintelligible. This is called clustering and may be related to poor speech planning. Voicing disorders are often unrecognized as a speech problem. They are characterized by unusual vocal qualities like excessive hoarseness, pitch, loudness, etc. This can make it difficult to understand the child. It can also cause social difficulties if peers perceive the abnormality as odd or atypical. It may even cause damage to the vocal apparatus if left untreated, and that's why she's feeling her neck. I'm about to go to sleep, and so if I trail off, it's because I'm so tired. Language disorders refer to problems associated with understanding and expressing language. We often divide language disorders into two broad categories. Expressive language disorder is a disorder where the individual has difficulty using language to express intent or meaning. Individuals having trouble with language expression may have trouble producing sentences of age-appropriate length or appropriate length or complexity. They may have a limited vocabulary and make frequent tense errors. The other broad classification for language disorders is mixed receptive expressive language disorder. This disorder is characterized by difficulties understanding the language of others, as well as difficulties with language expression. The child may have trouble understanding directions, following lectures, understanding the intent of others, as well as the expressive language difficulties. We do not diagnose pure receptive language disorders, since disorders in language reception are likely to involve an expressive component. If a student has difficulty understanding verbal directions provided by the teacher, their difficulty is likely to be evidenced in their communication following the instructions. A speech and language evaluation is likely to vary depending on the referral question. Questions regarding the student's ability to communicate effectively usually result in an assessment of both expressive and receptive language ability. Often, students are too young at the time of referral to produce a significant amount of verbal language. There are tests designed for this situation that stress pre-linguistic skill. These tests often consist of direct observation and parental interview. They document communication attempts and compare them to other children of the same age. Like most suspected disabilities, children suspected of having language or speech problems often receive an initial screening. If a screening shows that the child is having significant trouble, a referral is made to a speech-language pathologist who is specially trained to conduct a thorough language evaluation. An interdisciplinary special education team then determines eligibility for special education services and program planning. Interestingly, 88.3% of students with speech and language difficulties spend 80% or more of their time in the regular education classroom. This is in contrast to 3.8% of students with speech and language disability who spend between 40 and 79% in the regular education classroom. Together, this accounts for over 90% of the students maintaining a significant exposure to typically developing students. This is different from many other special education categories and is an excellent example of effective inclusion. Much of the sources of including speech and language assistance is due to the nature of the intervention. Speech problems often require some one-on-one therapy. Therapy sessions may be on a pull-out basis, but reinforcement of the skills is needed in the classroom and home environment. Therapy sessions focus on helping the child understand the nature of their difficulty and techniques to resolve the issue. Therapists show students how to manipulate tongue movements, airflow, and mouth position to correctly make sounds. Therapy for voicing problems helps students use their voices in appropriate and safe ways. Treatment for fluency problems is often more complex. What may begin as a mild fluency irregularity may quickly become complicated by the defensive behaviors and ineffective coping strategies used by the individual. The social and educational ramifications of the problem further complicate treatment. Students benefit from early interventions and intensive treatment. The nature of intellectual limitations and the public perception of the individuals who experience these difficulties have a long and problematic history. Even today, the general population is still dealing with what it means to have an intellectual disability. What can someone do who is intellectually limited? Can they hold a job? Are all individuals with intellectual disability like our neighbor's child? Answers to these questions are important. They are important to the individual wrestling with the experience of having intellectual disability, and also for society as our world deals with how to integrate these individuals into our lives, homes, schools, and workplaces. Unlike other special education classifications, there is a consistent approach used to define intellectual disability. First, the intellectual limitations need to be documented. These limitations are considered significant for someone their age. The exact word used to describe these significant intellectual impairments varies. Some use the term subaverage, as in the federal definition. Others use the term limited or the phrase below normal. All of these refer to the same concept. The second characteristic of intellectual disability involves impaired adaptive functioning. Adaptive functioning refers to how the individual adapts to the world in which they live. Can they dress and feed themselves? Can they get around the neighborhood? It encompasses conceptual, social, and practical skills people need to meet the demands of everyday life. The rationale for including adaptive measurements is that if individuals have significant intellectual impairments, there should be some manifestation of this limitation in their daily life. The third part of the definition of intellectual disability is that the impairment is apparent or is manifested during the developmental period. This qualification is intended to distinguish intellectual limitations present in the natural course of the individual's development from limitations acquired through trauma. Often individuals involved in head injuries have substantial intellectual impairments, but these impairments are unique and require a different treatment approach. It should also be noted that a diagnosis of intellectual disability is frequently diagnosed in conjunction with other disabilities. Children with autism or Down syndrome often have a concurrent diagnosis of intellectual disability. This is not always the case. Some students with autism have high intellectual functioning. Almost all assessment protocols for intellectual disability use an individually administered IQ test. The generally accepted operation definition of subaverage is 2 standard deviations below the mean, with deviations below the mean with a 5-point margin of error. On an individually administered IQ test, the mean is 100 with a standard deviation of 15. This results in an IQ score at or below scores ranging from 65 to 75. Assessment for adaptive behavior is usually completed by interview with the child's parents or guardian. Survey instruments have many questions related to the daily living, and the parent is asked if the child can complete each skill. As indicated in the federal definition, the student needs concurrent deficits in adaptive functioning. The third part of the diagnostic definition for intellectual ability is also established by interview. Parents are asked about the point where the child's exceptionality was recognized. Again, limitations need to be documented during the student's developmental period. Students with intellectual disability are often educated with at least part of the day spent in the regular education classroom. Data indicates that 20.1% of students with intellectual disabilities spend 80% of the, or more of their time in the regular education classroom. 27.6% spend between 40 and 79% of the day in the regular education classroom, and 46.1% spend less than 40% of the day in the regular education classroom. When deciding on appropriate instruction, educators need to keep in mind that extremely wide range of abilities possessed by individuals diagnosed with intellectual disability. Some of these individuals lead a relatively independent life with intermittent support. At the other end of the continuum are students who need full-time, constant supervision and support. With such a wide range of abilities, it becomes extremely important to create educational programming on an individual basis. The range of educational services for students with intellectual disability includes academic skills, self-help, and domestic skills, social skills, and transitional skills. The specific child dictates the depth of programming in each area. Individuals with milder impairments may spend most of their academic day engaged in academic work. This is supplemented with instructions in the other area as needed. Students with more significant impairment may receive less academic work, and the work they receive may be directly related to the particular life function, like cooking or baking something at the stove. I'm sorry, at the store, or buying something at the store. Don't buy something at the stove. Students with the most significant impairments may spend little time in the academic subjects, but educators need to be careful when making such decisions. It is important to realize often students are capable of more than initially thought with appropriate support. It is important to realize most students can make improvements in their overall life function with appropriate supports. For some students, this may mean improvements in socially appropriate smile or facial gestures. For others, this may include accurately balancing their checkbooks, keeping an open mind, and maintaining a curricular plan based on careful assessments is the best approach to helping students with intellectual disability achieve their potential. Did you notice they capitalized intellectual disability? That's kind of interesting. Autistic disorder is characterized by impairments in social relatedness and communication, as well as issues with repetitive or stereotype behaviors. Children with autism have multiple issues which potentially impair their ability to benefit from regular instruction. And I can tell you that I didn't grow up with anybody with autism. And the reason is because they they tended to institutionalize these individuals. Other individuals, yeah, they were in our classrooms, and of course this is back in the 50s and 60s, but we certainly didn't run into anybody that was autistic that I can remember. But remember, back then they didn't do anything with them. 70% of people who suffered from autism were mute, couldn't speak. Impairment in communication means students have difficulty expressing ideas verbally. They may have difficulty understanding or processing the language of someone else. Nonverbal communication may also be impaired. These students may not appreciate common gestures and body language. Their own nonverbal expressions may not accurately reflect their intent. This difficulty with communication translates into general problem relating to others. In a general problem. Individuals with autism have difficulty interacting in social situations. Some individuals may be so serious that the individual appears to ignore the outside world. Also evident in their behavior is repetitive or stereotype behaviors. These behaviors are repeated over and over in the same way, hand flapping, such as hand flapping and rocking. And you see a lot of rocking. You really see a lot of rocking. The term stereotype highlights the consistent nature of these repeated behaviors. The hand flapping tends to be when they're moving. Autism occurs in approximately 1 in 36 8-year-olds in the United States. This is up from a rate of 1 in 44 8-year-olds in 2021. Autism is also 4 times more common in boys than girls. The exact cause of the disorder remains elusive. Some researchers have linked it to neurological abnormalities or damage or learned behavior. Despite the difficulties understanding the cause of autism, the reality of the educational difficulties is quite clear. The problems of autistic individuals with social relatedness are completely opposed to the teacher-student educational model used in most classrooms. Even in milder forms of the disorder, where the student clearly interacts with others, the quality of the interaction often leads to negative reactions from peers and frustration. And one of the things that you need to remember, I don't know. Anyway, in the old days weren't that long ago. It was only about the DSM-4. People with mild autistic problems were referred to as having Asperger's syndrome. And with the DSM-5, I think the DSM-5 came out in 2013. With the DSM-5, they changed it to autism spectrum disorder, and they lumped all those people that had mild autistic symptoms into that category, which really upset a lot of parents, because a lot of parents had children with what they used to call Asperger's syndrome. And Asperger's syndrome to their mind, didn't sound nearly as bad as being on the spectrum, as my daughter says. I guess that's the new nomenclature. They're on the spectrum. Yeah. She teaches science in high school. Let's see if I can figure out where I was. Communication is a foundation of effective education. Producing lesson plans for students with autism that minimize direct communication and maximize experiential learning are difficult to develop. Children with autism can often communicate, but it is situationally dependent and inconsistent in quality. This also places unusual demands on the creative ability of the teacher to work with such limitations. From the perspective of the other students, the repetitive and stereotypical nature of the autistic behavior is a source of confusion and often frustration. Evaluations for autism often include intellectual assessments. Approximately 37.9% of individuals with autism have intellectual limitations. Some individuals with autism have normal to above normal intellectual ability, underscoring the importance of a thorough assessment. Now, this really gets kind of interesting, because someone can suffer from autism spectrum disorder, and they can so focus on one thing that they become experts in that one thing. And this is, we used to call this idiot savant. I'm not exactly sure if the idiot has been thrown out, but they have that kind of focus, which is really kind of interesting. I have known doctors who probably had Asperger's syndrome, and they were really good at their job as long as they only had to diagnose within their own specialty. They weren't GPs. They tended to specialize, especially surgeons. They can focus on one thing. I had a friend in college who had the ability. He could be at a party where there was all this loud noise and people were spilling beer on each other and just going crazy, and he could sit there and read a book. He could concentrate on the book because he had the ability to tune everything else out. And I considered it, I couldn't do that. I can't do that. I considered it probably Asperger's syndrome. I did. Don't tell him I said that. Brilliant, brilliant guy, but at the same time, a little bit socially awkward. Okay. Like their non-disabled peers, IQ score is a good predictor of later academic success. Other assessment instruments used in the diagnosis of autism include behavior rating scales. Popular scales include the Childhood Autism Rating Scale, the CARS, the Autism Behavior Checklist, ABC, and the Gilliam Autism Rating Scale, the GARS. GAR. These instruments specifically address the diagnostic criteria for the disorder, providing documentation of the child's relevant behavioral limitations. Now, the interesting thing about my friend is that he became a college professor and he taught Victorian literature. That was his specialty. And he's a very, very attractive man. I'm not saying that because I was attracted to him, but he was a very pretty guy. And he was a very successful college professor, but his lectures were just about as dull as dirt because he would read them. He would look down and he wouldn't look up at his students, and so they couldn't ask questions. Really kind of a fascinating situation. People liked to be in his class. It's not that he didn't teach them anything. It's just that he didn't answer anybody's questions. He rarely looked up. He was kind of like Indiana Jones in that when he had alpha hours, he was less likely to be there than to be there. So it was really kind of an interesting guy. But he was very successful. He's retired now, as I should probably be, since I'm a little younger than he is. He's probably 76. I'm 75. Anyway, interesting guy. Interesting guy. Very successful. Has written several books. Oh my God, they're so dull. They're so boring. Well, they're academic books about, Victorian literature. What could be more exciting than that? Frequently used tests are the Autism Diagnostic Observation Scale, the ADOS, and the Autism Diagnostic Interview Revised, the ADI-R. These two instruments provide information from direct interactions with the child and parent. Like most instruments in this area, information is specifically gathered along the diagnostic criteria for autism. One type of assessment is the functional assessment. This approach to testing assesses whether the child has the necessary skills to perform in a certain area. Children with autism are educated in a wide variety of settings. Approximately 40.8% of children with autism spend 80% or more of their day in the regular education classroom. An additional 17.2% spend between 40% and 79% of their time in the regular education classroom, and 34.1% spend less than 40% of their time in the regular education classroom. There are several instructional systems available to teach students with autism. Many of these systems lack sufficient research to warrant use in the school systems. Most schools choose to address the fundamental symptoms of the disorder rather than adopt a comprehensive intervention system. Approaches focus on increasing communication and social skills and decreasing repetitive and stereotypical behaviors. There are many communication alternatives used to help students with autism. Technology provides excellent options for alternative communication approaches. Computers can be programmed to accept different input modalities, which are then translated into speech. Communication cards can be used, where the child uses the cards by pointing to a picture that expresses their needs. Cards can be adapted to meet specific needs of the student. These options are helpful for students who have difficulty with oral speech. Social skills are challenging to remediate. The specific skills needed to interact effectively with others are complicated. Educational efforts to help children with autism develop better interaction skills often break down a typical social situation and reinforce each separate skill. With consistent feedback and multiple opportunities to practice a given skill, these children can often develop a successful skill set, enabling them to interact more effectively. The students with autism can present a challenge to teachers. Classroom teachers typically work in close collaboration with other professionals experienced in the field. It is important to remember that education is a collaborative effort. Many educational professionals and family members share the education of students with autism. Together, this educational team can provide students with a supportive instructional experience. Emotional disturbance is a broad special education classification covering many problems. It includes things like aggressive acting out, conduct problems, anxiety, and depression. It is difficult to define students who receive special education assistance under this category because their problems manifest in different ways. The amount of language devoted to defining this category is more extensive than for many of the other special education definitions. The complexity of the definition is a product of the complexity of the issues served under this category. Practitioners often use a dimensional approach to identifying educationally relevant problems. This approach defines 4 important dimensions to consider when determining whether a problem warrants special assistance. The 4 dimensions include the frequency or rate of the behavior, the intensity of the behavior's duration, and the expression of the behavior relative to other children the same age. This approach examines if the frequency, intensity, and duration of the behavior is unusual for the child's age. Following this approach helps to contextualize the behavior according to what is typical for children. When defining an emotional disturbance, it is equally important to clarify what is not considered a part of this disability category. The federal definition specifically mentions that a social maladjustment is not covered under the category. That means they're spoiled. So spoiled children don't fit under this. Distinguishing between social maladjustment and emotional disturbance is difficult. Many researchers contend that making this distinction is not only difficult, but also unfounded. Students with social maladjustments are still difficult to manage in the classroom. Their problems often interfere with their academic performance and require spatial attention. Some researchers argue that the exclusionary clause in the federal definition to narrowly focus services leaves many children without needed help. The National Center for Educational Statistics reports that 5.8% of students in special education are receiving services under this category. This makes it the 7th largest special education category. Identification of students requiring services under the emotional disturbance classification is difficult. The broad range of issues covered by the definition makes it hard to establish a proven identification process. Some approaches are more common than other approaches. Functional behavioral assessment is one of those approaches. Federal law mandates it in certain circumstances. This approach starts with the position that behaviors are supported by their consequences. They do not occur unless something is gained or rewarded. The goal of the assessment is to determine what consequences are supporting the behavior. It is important to examine elements in the child's environment prior to the behavior in question to see what is setting the stage for the occurrence of the behavior. Based on this information, a plan is made to modify expression of the behavior. Results are systematically recorded and analyzed for success. Other assessment approaches emphasize different aspects of the diagnostic process. The person-centered planning approach stresses the importance of developing a long-term plan for the student prior to any changes in educational programming. Treatment then follows the vision for the student. Strength-based assessment emphasizes the importance of using a student's strengths during intervention. All too often, treatment focuses on students' deficits and fails to document and effectively use an area of strength to support a deficit. I have to tell you right now that I've got my great nephew has rage issues because he's the one that his mother was a heroin addict, and she shot up while she was pregnant, and he was born with an addiction, and because of that, it seems to have adjusted his brain to the extent that from time to time he just goes literally goes berserk, which is kind of interesting. And so the next two, this guy and this guy, that would be my nephew. It's not really my great nephew. I don't have pictures of him, not since he grew up a little bit. He's 9 now, I guess, and having problems in school. Behavior modification is probably the most frequently used programs for the treatment of children with emotional disturbances. It is based on the principle of behaviorism. Students working under a behavior modification program learn in highly structured environments. Teachers provide consistent and well-planned feedback for everything from behavior to academics. The approach is time-consuming and often requires professional assistance. Given this level of support, smaller self-contained classrooms and separate schools may benefit more from this approach. Successful behavioral interventions are possible in the regular classroom with appropriate supports and planning. Some schools are also taking a proactive approach, attempting to encourage appropriate behavior before problems surface. Positive behavioral supports is an active activity or technique designed to help students develop appropriate and adaptive behaviors and to overcome existing behavioral challenges. The approach provides behavioral supports contextualized in a positive way to stop problem behaviors from escalating. Even with good behavioral programs in place, many educators are turning to additional systems to help provide students with an awareness of their behavior. The life space intervention approach is an insight-based approach designed to give students a better perspective on how they function in the world. The approach promotes building positive relationships, resolving crises effectively, and fostering responsible behavior. Conflict resolution refers to a group of approaches that attempt to improve social interactions through successful mediation of conflict. Conflicts often produce negative behaviors, such as fighting, insulting, and threatening. They also produce passive behaviors, such as ignoring the conflict or person, giving in, and refusing to listen. Conflict resolution provides a system to avoid these potentially ineffectual behaviors, increasing the potential for positive social interactions. 4 basic steps involved in a successful conflict resolution include: individuals agree to follow basic ground rules such as no name calling or interrupting. Each person gets a chance to tell their side of the story. A mediator is often used to help the individual accurately convey their meaning and to help the other person understand the meaning of the message. The participants develop possible solutions to the problem. A solution is agreed upon. It is important that the solution is specific and viewed as possible by all parties. Often students get into trouble because of frustration with schoolwork. Helping students better manage their time can lead to more productive and effective work, which in turn supports feelings of success rather than frustration. Time management involves helping students structure daily tasks, manage study time to produce maximal results, and transition effectively between tasks. Students often have little awareness of how they spend their day. Time management skills help to create awareness of how they spend their time and how to modify their current schedule to be more academically successful. This eases stress and frustration and helps students avoid acting out behaviors. Teachers can also help avoid behavior problems by paying careful attention to the arrangement of the classroom and how close the students are to each other. Research shows that students are much more likely to exhibit problematic behavior the further they are from the teacher. Teachers can increase their proximity to students who have emotional and behavioral difficulties. They can also create the perception of closeness by asking frequent. Thanks, that's Facebook. They can also create the perception of closeness by asking frequent questions and interacting briefly with the students. Teachers should also ensure the classroom is free of overly congested areas and that procedures for using classroom facilities are clear. Hearing is one of our most prominent senses. All through the day, we use our hearing ability to mediate almost all our activities. Despite this reliance on hearing, individuals with hearing loss can lead full independent lives with appropriate supports and accommodations. Hearing impairments, as a special education category, encompass many different levels of impairment. Some students have mild hearing loss with minimal impact on their educational lives. Other students have significant losses and require sophisticated support. The term hearing impairment is the preferred term for special education purposes, but it is rejected by many experiencing hearing abnormalities. Some believe framing their life circumstances in the terms of impairment is negative. Another definitional issue with hearing impairments concern the word deaf. Typically, individuals classified as deaf are unable to process linguistic information through hearing. This is different from the type of hearing impairments covered under the Hearing Impairment Disability Classification. Hearing problems are classified according to the nature of the hearing impairment. An audiologist uses a variety of instruments to identify the exact nature of hearing loss. Correct identification of the problem is crucial to providing appropriate support. Students who are candidates for amplification devices will need a different support structure from students with profound hearing loss. An air conduction auditor. Every time I see that, I want to say air conditioning. Air conduction audiometry test can indicate a conductive hearing loss, but it needs to be compared to a test looking at possible nerve impairment. A bone conduction audiometry test that nerve functioning of the ear, that tests the nerve functioning of the ear. Deficits on an air conduction test only indicate a conduction hearing loss, meaning amplification supports are likely. Deficits in both air conduction and bone conduction tests provide evidence of a non-sensory neural hearing loss. In these cases, amplification may or may not be used, which means greater reliance on other educational modifications. Understanding the nature of hearing loss is important when designing an effective educational intervention. Most students with hearing impairments will receive a combination of support and modification to address their needs. Okay, this talks about all the problems that you can potentially have. If you have an air conduction problem, that means that amplification can help you. Okay, that has to do with your inner ear. It could also have to do with your inner ear. But it has to do with the conduction, the fact that the sound isn't getting in. If the bone, we not only hear we not only hear with our ears, but we also hear through our bones. Okay, so the bone conduction test tells us whether we have. There's a breakdown in the auditory nerve. If we have a problem with our auditory nerve, we're not going to hear anything at all. And these are the individuals that are referred to as deaf. And the reason they're deaf is because they can't hear anything at all. They don't get any sound through their skulls. They don't get any sound through their ears. Okay, so these people aren't hearing anything at all, and they're the individuals that will use the sign language, and they will start reading lips. And this is really what we're talking about. So if it's an air conduction problem, then you can use a hearing aid. If it's a bone conduction problem, then there is a way to amplify sound going into the bone, if that is the problem. But if it's a auditory nerve problem, there's no way we can help somebody hear, because that it is the auditory nerve that that produces the sound, that tells our brain about the sound. So that's the problem. Okay. So there are three different things that we're looking at. One is the bone conduction. That's where you'll see an amplifier stuck to the back of somebody's head. If it's a hearing aid, which potentially I need because I'm so old, but if it's a hearing aid, of course, that just amplifies the sound coming into the ears. But if those two things can't help, then the individual will have to learn other ways of communicating, like reading lips and sign language. There are approximately 37.5 million people with some degree of hearing impairment. That might include me, as my daughter thinks I can't hear anything. The reality is I have hearing loss at specific decibels, not decibels. That's not what I'm thinking. What am I thinking? Frequencies, at certain frequencies. So I'm starting to have problems hearing the female voices. The other day I was we were eating at a bar and grill, and they were playing music, and all I could hear was the harmony. I couldn't hear the melody. It was so weird. I thought, well, that's the strangest song I've ever heard. And another time I couldn't hear either the melody or the harmony. All I could hear was the beat, the drums. I could hear the beat. They were really strange. Yeah, maybe I do need a hearing aid. I don't know. I didn't miss the music though. It was country and western music. So no offense to you guys who listen to country and western music, but I didn't need to hear it. Providing appropriate education for such a large population is challenging. Some students will receive necessary accommodation and classroom modifications in their home school. Other students may attend separate educational facilities for students with hearing impairments. In both situations, students are likely to use a combination of educational support designed to provide them with an appropriate educational environment. This is an interesting picture because she's an audiometrist, and this is a air conduction test, and they're testing each ear, her left ear and her right ear. And I'm okay in my left ear, but my right ear has a little bit of hearing loss, and well, I won't tell you why. Has to do with the military. Accommodations for students with hearing impairments vary depending on the nature and severity of the disorder. Note-taking assistance is a common accommodation. Students with hearing impairments may not be able to take consistent notes because they rely more on vision for incoming information. They will miss new information if they look down to take notes, and they will miss notes if they continue to look up at the teacher or translator. Technology is providing some new options for these students. Computers are making real-time captioning a possibility. These devices provide a visual display of the teacher's comments in writing, much like closed captioning on television. The technology makes use of sophisticated voice recognition software. Voice recognition makes it possible for a student to walk out of a class with a complete transcript of everything said in the class. These systems are not always 100% accurate, but they provide an informational foundation for students. Teachers also need to make frequent use of visual media, including overhead transparencies, video projection, and computer presentations. Teachers need to remember that students with hearing impairments make constant use of visual information and need unobstructed visual access to the teacher or other educational materials. Amplification can help students with certain hearing loss. And this is what I was talking about. This is one that is attached to her skull, and that will amplify the vibrations in the inner skull. Amplification benefits students with air conduction hearing loss. That's not an air conduction hearing loss. Amplification devices sometimes take the form of a hearing aid worn by the students. They may also consist of a direct radio link between a device worn by the teacher and the student. The teacher wears a transmitter and the student wears the receiver. This approach is advantageous because only the teacher's voice is amplified, not the entire classroom environment. Translators are another common accommodation for students fluent in manual forms of communication, in other words, sign language, and that's what she's doing, and that's what she's doing. I guess they're learning sign language. Students who are not hearing impaired often enjoy having a translator in the class. That sounds weird, doesn't it? At first, the translator's signing may be distracting, but students quickly accommodate to the presence of the translator and exposure to another mode of communication. Special education law makes a distinction between a degree of hearing impairment and an almost complete loss of hearing. If a student has a mild to moderate hearing loss, they are likely to obtain special education services under the hearing impairment category. Deafness refers to students who have severe or profound hearing loss. The IDEA definition identifies deafness as impairment in processing language that is presented auditorily. The diagnosis and treatment of students meeting the criteria for deafness are like students classified as hearing impaired. And we can tell that she has that type of a hearing loss because she's signing. Teachers place considerable importance on a student's ability to see. Lessons are often supplemented with visual supports like posters, computer-generated presentations, and demonstrations. Teachers also convey important information through body language and facial expressions. Students with visual impairments are likely to miss much of the visually mediated information, like how to fly an airplane. I guess that's what she's doing. Approximately 0.3% of special education students, around 25,000, require educational support for visual impairment. Despite classification under a single category, students with visual impairments have many different types of impairment. Visual impairment are usually defined as affective visual acuity or visual field. Visual acuity refers to the ability of the individual to perceive details. It is how well you can see, identify objects, and benefit from the information in the visual field. Visual field refers to how far your vision extends while looking straight ahead. Diagnostically, it is important for the educational team to understand the nature and severity of a student's visual impairment. Many conditions can lead to limited vision or blindness. Medical conditions such as glaucoma or cataracts can impair vision. Congenital, present at birth, abnormalities of the eyes or trauma can also impair vision. Diagnosis of visual problems usually follows routine medical examinations at birth or regular screenings at school or the doctors. Screening for problems with visual acuity typically uses a Snellen chart, and that's a Snellen chart to your left. Vision is measured as the number of feet the person needs to be away from the chart compared to an individual with normal vision. If a student sees 2100 in their left eye, this means they need to be 20 feet from the Snellen chart to read something that a person with normal vision can read at a distance of 100 feet. Legally blind is defined as visual acuity of 2200 or less in the individual's best eye with correction. And that's 2200 right there. And you've seen these Snellen charts all over the place. This is 2010 right here, I think. Or maybe it's there. When I joined the military, I had 2010 vision, and they wanted to make me a helicopter pilot. And I thought, ooh, bad idea. they were surviving for about 10 seconds in combat. So, you know, it's a rock that flies. And if that rotor stops spinning, then it drops to the ground like a rock. Except it's not a rock, and it just kind of folds up like a wad of paper. To receive special education services, a visual impairment must negatively affect the student's educational progress. This means students with suspected visual impairments need a comprehensive battery of academic tests. Some tests provide versions of the visually impaired for the visually impaired, but often this requires modification of standardized testing protocols. Examiners need to be mindful of the range of visual problems impacting the educational assessment, including visual acuity, color blindness, and field of vision. These factors are important to remove from the assessment equation so that only academic skills are assessed. Any modification in standardized testing procedures are reported and considered with the test results. Well, we were talking about cataracts and glaucoma. My brother has glaucoma, and of course he wants me to have it too because that's hereditary, but I don't. He's also really sensitive to caffeine, and I'm not, so that's kind of interesting. My wife's brother has had cataract surgery twice, so he develops cataracts very readily. I'm not exactly sure why. But I don't have cataracts. I don't have glaucoma, much to my brother's chagrin. Over half of students with visual impairments, 69.7%, spend 80% or more of their day in the regular classroom. The regular classroom is the most common educational environment. Few students with visual impairments receive services in residential facility or separate schools. The classroom space requires special consideration. Often students with visual impairment are sensitive to lighting and glare. Preferential seating will help the students see as much of the teacher's nonverbal cues as possible. Since students with visual impairments will have difficulty identifying classroom elements by sight, teachers need to introduce them to the classroom. It is important to allow time for practice and learning. Consistency in room layout and function will help students adapt to the classroom routine. Students who are both deaf and blind require exceptional support and are classified under their own category for special education purposes. The IDEA, there's another one of those, I can't remember what they call those, but yeah, he has bone conduction deafness. The IDEA definition of deaf blindness requires that students classified under the category have simultaneous impairments in hearing and vision. Like other special education definitions, the impairment must negatively affect academic performance. Unique to this definition is the qualifier that the impairment must be so severe that the student cannot be appropriately accommodated when classified as only deaf or blind. And this is driving me crazy. I'm going to find out what that is called because I know it. uh, Uh, Cochlear implants, that's what they're called. Cochlear implants. Sorry. All right. Cochlear implants. We learned, I already knew that, and I don't know why I didn't remember it. But I apologize. Cochlear implants. The number of children receiving special education services under the deaf blindness category totaled approximately 2,000 in 2021-22. Although the overall number of students in this category is quite low, the resources needed to provide them with appropriate education are extensive, often resulting in more restrictive placements. Only 30.1% spend 80% or more of their day in the regular classroom, and 18.5% receive their education in a separate school for students with disabilities. The assessment and treatment approaches are like the ones described previously for hearing and visually impaired students. The coordination of these services is unique, given that the students have substantial losses in two primary sensory subsystems. The uniqueness of their learning situation requires an equally unique educational approach. Teachers and related educational professionals need to be insightful, reflective, and flexible in meeting the dynamic needs of these exceptional students. Orthopedic impairment refers to individuals who were born with a missing limb or who lost a member through injury. It also covers the orthopedic impairment due to certain medical conditions, as poliomyelitis, bone tuberculosis, cerebral palsy, and fractures or burns that cause abnormal contracture of the muscles. In 2021-2022, there were approximately 33,000 students being served under this disability classification. Now, this is really kind of interesting because until the polio vaccine wasn't invented until 1954. It wasn't developed until 1954. So I was born in 1949. There were individuals in my class who had polio, and which meant that they had a physical problem, physical deformity. Usually the limb didn't grow. And in those cases, it was usually one of their legs. But these kids came to school. There was no problem with that. Anyways, seems like why you would keep these individuals out of school is a little strange. No, it's not, because we're going to see in just a second. And there's the reason why. It's for the children with who are in wheelchairs. There was no accessibility for children with wheelchairs in my school. They didn't have to. Now they do, of course. They have to make them wheelchair accessible. All government buildings have to be wheelchair accessible. But not back then. Assessment for this classification typically happens outside the school system by a qualified medical professional. Over half, 57.9%, of students classified as orthopedically impaired spend 80% or more of their school day in the regular education classroom. An additional 35% are educated in a combination of the regular classroom and other educational settings appropriate to their individual needs. Some students require placement in a special school or residential facility, but this is rare, about 3%. One of the primary difficulties experienced by students classified as orthopedically impaired is simply navigating the educational facilities. They are also likely to have trouble participating in typical physical education activities. Technological solutions can provide remarkable accommodations for these students. Mechanical prosthetic devices can give students with missing limbs the ability to move independently. Some students require structural aids and braces to maintain a bodily position required for mobility. There are also a variety of mechanical and electronic chairs that can help students participate more fully in school life. Developers of IDEA recognize the inherent difficulty in providing enough disability categories to cover all situations requiring assistance. To address this issue, a special category of other health impaired was established. Students receiving special education services under this category vary significantly in the qualifying condition. Some have major health impairments such as epilepsy, diabetes, heart conditions, and asthma. Others suffer from infectious diseases such as acquired immune deficiency syndrome. Relatively new to this category is the specific mentioning of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD. And one that we may be seeing in the future is long haul COVID, and we'll see whether how that plays itself out. Although students with ADHD may receive special education services, it is more common for them to receive assistance through another law, the Vocational Rehabilitation Act of 1974. The only consistent educational suggestion one can make for students in this category is educators need to become familiar with the nature of the health impairment. Some conditions like asthma require the teacher know that what triggers an asthma attack and what to do if it happens. Other conditions like AIDS require the teacher to help the student manage their care while at school. Students with AIDS may suffer from fatigue and frequent absences. They also are likely to have some difficulty with the social stigma associated with the disorder. Each of the conditions served under this category are different, requiring a unique understanding on the part of the teacher. Some students qualify for services under more than one of the special education categories. This relatively unique situation resulted in the creation of a special education category just for students having multiple disabilities. Students may have intellectual disability and a visual impairment. They may have a learning disability and an emotional disturbance. There are many possible combinations, but students need to have multiple impairments creating severe educational need to qualify for services. How individual states implement the federal definition for multiple disabilities varies. Some states use this category only for rare cases, electing to serve students with multiple disabilities under a category for one of their impairments. This is because it is not always clear that a student is experiencing any additional educational impairment because they qualify for multiple special education categories. Often the student is best served by using a primary disability category. Other states more readily use the multiple disabilities category. The underlying premise is to determine how best to serve the student and which disability classification is most appropriate for the child and their unique needs. Only about 15.5% of students receiving services under this category are in the regular classroom, 80% or more of the day. Approximately 18% spend 40 to 79% of their day in the regular classroom, and 43.5% spend less than 40% of their day in the regular classroom. About 16.8% of students classify as having multiple disabilities are placed in a separate classroom. Inclusion is more challenging with these students due to the complexity of the needs of the child combined with limitations inherent in existing school facilities. Schools serving the needs of these students often elect to build and staff a single educational space to meet the challenging demands of these children, rather than modify each regular classroom. Spatial space makes for more efficient use of resources, but educators need to constantly reassess if there is a way to meet the child's needs in a more traditional placement. There are benefits to allowing students with special needs to interact with their non-disabled peers while at school. Interactions benefit the student with disabilities as well as their typically developing peers. As students with multiple disabilities continue to grow and learn, they may be able to integrate into typical classrooms. Constant assessment and evaluation will help ensure these students are educated in the least restrictive placement. And that is IDA, least restrictive placement. The brain exerts downward control over almost every system of the body. It is also the seat of our remarkable ability to think and reason. Brain injuries are not common, yet when a student experiences one, the results can be devastating. Every head injury is unique, and the resulting impairment can impact almost any aspect of human functioning. Given the potential damage caused by a head injury, special education law has established a category of disability just for students who have experienced brain trauma. And we can see one right here. It's right there. That is he's bleeding into his brain, and it's causing swelling. TBI, traumatic brain injury. Federal law specifies that students who receive open or closed head injuries may receive services under this category. Open head injuries are those where the skull is breached, exposing underlying tissue. A closed head injury is one where there is trauma to the head, but the skull remains intact. And this is a closed. These two are closed. I would qualify that as open. Either type of injury can cause significant impairment, but an open head injury is particularly damaging because of the direct insult to brain tissue. It is impossible to capture all the problems resulting from head injury, but the IDEA definition mentions specific issues. Injuries due to birth trauma, congenital problems, or degenerative disorders are not served under this category. They are served under another category, not one of the 13. Assessment of a brain injury can be difficult given the wide-ranging effects brain injury can have. Assessment typically brings together professionals to assess different motor, cognitive, and behavioral factors. Some injuries are specific, only affecting a single function. I missed a comma right there. Others are more pervasive, affecting physical activity and ability to think and reason. And as you can see, this kid got hit here, and then he got the rebound effect because the brain is open in there, and it can bounce back and forth between their skull. Now he's got damage on both sides, and it's causing localized swelling. Often assessment following a brain injury begins with screening many areas of functioning. This is followed by intensive assessment of those areas impacted by the injury. Other times, a child may not appear to have difficulty, only to discover there are issues once the child returns to the normal routine. And this usually has to do with swelling in the brain. Sometimes when you damage something, if you sprain your ankle, does it swell up right away? Well, usually it does. Sometimes it doesn't start swelling until later. Well, anyway, what are we doing? Assessment in this case may occur months after the actual injury. What is most difficult about assessment following a head injury is that the impairment may be subtle and difficult to determine. There may be a clear decrease in academic performance, but the nature of the trouble may be hard to define. And that's another part of the problem. Sometimes it swells, and therefore it keeps it from reacting. And as soon as the swelling goes down, then we get a reaction. That's sometimes part of the problem. Oh, and that's it. We are done. Okay, I'll talk to you again next week. Shorter chapter next week, I promise.